So, you've probably heard the story, right? Maybe you saw the movie or read the book. The idea that Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene were secretly married and that their bloodline has been hidden for centuries. It's a fascinating, really dramatic tale. But what if it's not just some harmless fiction? What if this modern story actually had the power to completely shatter a person's life? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into.
See, the source material for this explainer comes from Dr. Kerolos Kamal Rezk. And for him, this wasn't some abstract historical debate. He's an anesthesiologist, and his life got turned completely upside down when this very myth became a core reason for the collapse of his own marriage. So for him, this was deeply personal, a painful confrontation with a story that had devastating, real-world consequences.
So, yeah, we're not just looking at dusty old history books today. We're actually following a personal quest for truth. Think about it. As a medical doctor, Dr. Rezk is trained in precision, in evidence, in clarity. And as a Coptic Orthodox Christian, he's anchored in a very ancient faith. He had to untangle this modern myth, piece by painful piece, just to figure out what was actually real.
Okay, so first things first. If you want to find evidence of a marriage, where do you look? You go to the primary sources, right? The earliest texts we have. So what do the Gospels actually say?
And right away we hit a brick wall. This is what historians call the argument from silence, and it's a big deal. It's not just that there's a lack of information. I mean, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're pretty detailed about Jesus' important relationships. His mother, his disciples, even Peter's mother-in-law gets a mention. The fact that they never once mention a wife or children, well, that silence is deafening. It's a huge clue that for the earliest followers, this just wasn't part of the story.
So, you might be asking, where does this whole marriage idea even come from? Well, proponents almost always point to a different set of texts, the Gnostic Gospels. But look at the difference here. The canonical Gospels are our earliest sources, written within a lifetime of the actual events. The Gnostic texts, they show up much, much later, sometimes hundreds of years later. And their goal wasn't really to record history. They were deep, complex, symbolic theological works. You're basically comparing a biography to a book of mystical poetry. And this right here is a perfect example of the whole problem. The supposed smoking gun is a single Greek word, koinonos, which is used to describe Mary in the Gnostic Gospel of Philip. Now, in pop culture, this gets translated as wife or consort. But that's not what it meant. In its actual context, the word meant a partner, an associate, someone who shares in a common mission. It was about a spiritual partnership, not a marriage certificate.
So here's the bottom line. When you read in these Gnostic texts about Jesus kissing Mary or her being his special companion, they're using physical language as a metaphor. It's a symbol for a deep spiritual connection, for passing on secret knowledge or gnosis. I mean, the scholarly consensus on this is overwhelming. The intimacy they're talking about is theological, not, domestic.
And that brings us to the next huge mistake the marriage myth makes. It's a concept called anachronism. It's basically the error of judging the ancient world by our modern standards, of projecting our own ideas and values onto a time that had a totally different set of rules.
This is probably the biggest argument you hear, and it's the one that Dr. Rezk had to deal with head-on in his own life. The claim is that as a respected Jewish teacher in the first century, Jesus would have been expected to be married, that it was practically required. It sounds logical, right? But is it actually true?
Oh no. When you look at the actual history, the story is way more complicated. Celibacy was absolutely not unthinkable. You had whole Jewish groups like the Essenes who practiced it. You had respected rabbis who chose to devote their lives to sacred study instead of family. And especially for a prophet like Jesus who was preaching that the kingdom of God was at hand, his all-consuming mission would have taken precedence. So being single wasn't weird at all. It actually fits his historical context perfectly.
Okay. So if the evidence isn't in the ancient texts and it doesn't fit the historical context, where in the world did this story come from? Turns out, this so-called ancient secret is actually a pretty modern invention.
Just look at this timeline. These ideas that feel so ancient to a lot of us, they only really grabbed hold of the public imagination in the last 40 years or so. It really started with a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail back in '82, and then it just exploded into this global thing with the Da Vinci Code in 2003. This isn't some rediscovered history. It's recent pop culture.
And here's the kicker. This is the truly stunning part. The book that kicked it all off, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, was built on a foundation of, well, nothing. The core evidence it used came from documents that were later exposed as a total hoax. They were literally fabricated by a convicted con artist in France. The entire theory, the whole thing, is based on a fraud.
So how did a story based on a hoax get so popular? Well, Dr. Rezk breaks down the playbook for this kind of pseudo-history. First, you just bombard the reader with a ton of disconnected facts so it feels like there must be something there. Then, you use conspiracy logic. Any lack of evidence just becomes proof of a massive cover-up. And finally, you make it look all scholarly with lots of footnotes and citations that, if you actually bother to check them, totally fall apart.
So, after we tear down this whole modern myth, what are we left with? Well, what we find is actually something far more powerful. It's time to recover the real, historical Mary Magdalene.
And for Dr. Rezk, the author, the truth was waiting for him right inside his own faith. The Coptic Orthodox Church is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, and for 2,000 years, they've held on to a consistent memory of Mary Magdalene. And in their tradition, she's not a wife, she's not even primarily a repentant sinner. She is a central, courageous apostle. For him, this ancient tradition was the anchor he needed against this huge wave of modern myth-making.
And this is the woman we meet when we go back to the actual evidence in the earliest Gospels, a key disciple who literally helped fund Jesus' ministry, one of the very few brave enough to stand by him at the cross when almost everyone else fled. She was the first person to witness the resurrection, and Jesus himself gave her the job of telling the other apostles the news. She's called the apostle to the apostles for a reason.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The real tragedy here isn't that they weren't married. The real tragedy is that in our excitement to create a modern romantic myth, we've almost completely ignored the real woman, a historic leader whose actual story was already more than powerful enough for any time in history.
So in the end, the author's journey takes him from all the chaos and personal pain caused by a modern fiction, right back to the clarity of history and his own ancient faith. The Coptic tradition never needed to invent a new story, because it never forgot the true one. Mary Magdalene, the healed disciple, the brave witness, the apostle to the apostles.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. We're so often told that a secret marriage is what would make Mary Magdalene important. But what if the truth is actually way more radical? What if the story of a woman whose significance comes not from her relationship to a man, but from her own faith, her own courage, and her own apostolic leadership? What if that's actually a far more powerful and inspiring story for us today?